Hello and welcome. Are League Start builds expensive? Time and time again, I hear people talk about how they're turned off by this or that League Start build because it sounds expensive to build, and it sounds like they're not going to be able to afford it. But if you think about it, any build that is expensive to start isn't a League Start build. It's not something you should be considering. The reason for this is a League Start build is something that you want to use to take your first steps into the new economy, to take your first steps into the new content. You don't need pre-existing gear or setups or expensive endgame items to do that. You're not doing, super juiced 100% delirious tier 19 maps on day one. And I think that's something that gets lost a lot. So what were some of the most popular starter builds in Harvest League that I heard people talk about as being expensive? Two that come to mind are ED Contagion and Volatile Dead Spellslinger. I've, at multiple points, heard people say, oh, this looks expensive, or oh, when I look up characters, all the gear's expensive. And I think that's partially the fault of people creating content here on YouTube and elsewhere for showcasing League Starter builds in expensive gear, as opposed to showcasing them in actual League Start gear. I also think it's the fault of the fact that the way PoE Ninja works is it displays things by level, so you often get a top-down of, these are the people who have put in the most time and likely the most effort and found the most success of a build, but not necessarily the reflection of the average person playing this build. To try to combat that some, I went back in time using a feature on PoE Ninja that snapshots builds from a specific time point. Specifically, I looked at week 1 and week 2 of Harvest League, and I was specifically looking at softcore SSF. Why am I looking at softcore SSF? If a build requires expensive endgame items that you can only get early on by trading with other players, it won't be SSF viable. And I realized that harvest crafting is kind of insane. So a lot of people, even in SSF, will have better gear than normal, which is why I also limited the search to characters level 93 or lower. Because I've cut off the top end, I feel I've averaged the gear out. And sure enough, we get a very different picture looking at SSF, softcore, 93 or lower, which in this case is 80 to 93, as opposed to looking at softcore trade. There are a few things worth talking about, and a few things that I think I can kind of exclude from the list because they're influenced more by popularity and the fact that they're new and shiny, rather than that they are a tried and true League starter that's good every league. So the things that I'm going to cut out here or put caveats on are Tectonic Slam, Earth Shatter, and Earthquake. I think all three skills have the potential to be a good League starter, but because they were new, that greatly influenced the play rates, and I can't say for sure which one of them, or which ones of them, will end up being good. Personally, I suspect that Earthquake will fall off, Tectonic Slam will go up, and Earth Shatter will stay about the same. But that's just purely conjecture. 2 weeks into Heist League, we'll see which of these actually works out. So what does that leave? Volatile Dead Spellslinger Necromancer, which is arguably one of these strongest starter builds. I think it is somewhat slower than Chaos Slinger, but it has better high-end scaling. ED Contagion Trickster, which has been for a very long time the classic, reliable, cheap League starter build. Raised Spectre Necro. Necros have been very strong. The flavor of Necro that you play has changed, especially as leagues go on. Sometimes it's zombies, sometimes it's skellies, sometimes it's specters. I think Minion Necro is a really solid choice, and there's going to be some version of Minion Necro that's going to be strong. Who knows? Maybe specters get a nerf and we all end up playing carrion golems if we want minions. Something will be there, and it's worth including on the list. And then finally, Ball Lightning Mine Sabo, which this one I actually didn't expect to see in SSF. I expected to see it eclipsed by Toxic Rain. Toxic Rain I do want to kind of give an honorable mention. It was a little bit below the popularity of all of these builds, but it didn't have a shabby representation. It was just very split between Toxic Rain Mines and Self-Attack Trickster. So now I'm going to go into a little bit about these builds and why they are so cheap, and why it's totally okay to start them, even without expensive items. So the first premise of it is, you don't need expensive items because looking at these builds in SSF, most of them do not have very expensive things. They use very few uniques, and most of the uniques that they do use are fairly common or easy to obtain. In terms of the rares, nothing with overly specific stats tends to come up. So if you're playing ED Contagion Trickster, I see some bows, because it's an easy to get 6-link that you can farm, and I see a lot of wand and shield or dual wand. The reason this works is because ED Contagion, all you really need to clear with it is a decently leveled gem, You don't even really need a 20/20, just a 20/0 is fine. You need an extra 4-link for your Contagion. You need a couple of plus gem levels if you can get them on either your wand or your shield, and then you're good to go. Obviously, the single target of this build will not be spectacular. It will take some time to kill tanky rares. People tend to struggle with Conquerors a little bit, but if you play to the mechanics, you dodge around, you will be fine on those fights, and not everything early league is about one-shotting bosses. I know this is probably a shocking phrase if you look at a lot of the League starter builds on YouTube, but if it takes you 3 or 4 minutes to kill a Conqueror, that's your first Conqueror kill of League, that's totally fine. If your first Sirus takes you 7 minutes, that's totally fine. It is more about safety and good mechanics, and ED Contagion has both. Similarly, Volatile Dead Spellslinger Necro has some single target problems, but because of the built-in attack speed scaling and the damage ramp from corpses, which Necromancer and Volatile Dead offer respectively, it's very easy to clear maps. You can kind of build up a bunch of balls, move forwards, they'll kill everything, drop some more balls, move forwards. It's a quite safe playstyle due to this damage persistence. And again, sure, it's nice to have an Essence crafted +1 Gems wand, but you don't really need that. Any +1 Gems wand with decent base attack speed's fine. Any, decent Essence crafted wand is fine to start with. And there's a lot of scaling options. You can scale it via going for the gem route. You can scale it via adding flat damage. And as a result, it clears very well with very little gear. You can quite literally use trash off the floor and you will be fine. Similarly, minions literally do not scale off of most of your items. And some of the items that you do want, such as +1 Spectre gem level boots, are pretty easy to roll with Elder Influence, or the Grip of a Council, which is a prophecy chain that you can very easily self-farm. There's also items like Skullhead that, while not necessarily easy to deterministically create, do drop pretty commonly, so odds are you're going to get one. All this combines with the fact that, again, like most of the other things on the list, this scales very heavily off of gem level. So if you have a level 20 Spectre gem, you're probably pretty good. You don't need specific gear, and therefore it's not expensive. Ball Lightning Mine Sabo leverages something a little different. In this case, it leverages the defenses that the Saboteur Ascendancy has. It has a mix of damage reduction, avoidance, and recovery, which is great, along with the insane damage that just putting almost anything on a mine gives you. The reason that Ball Lightning Mines are better than just a random other spell like Freeze Pulse is less a matter of the fact that the Freeze Pulse won't do damage, and more a matter of the fact that Ball Lightning Mines have better coverage and feel better to play, so it's a better end result when almost anything does good damage. Then the last thing I want to talk about is the more traditional melee starter, which would be Cyclone, or sometimes Bleed Lacerate. And both of these are very similar in that, again, you don't need very much specific gear. Sure, you'll want a Paradoxica and a Savior eventually on your Cyclone, but do you need to get started? Nah. You can use Ons, you can use Skeva, you can use Ichimonji, you can use whatever random rare swords you get. You don't even really have to use swords. You could go with random dual axes, and that's fine. You could probably go with a staff, a Hegemony's Era, for example. Or you could use a two-handed sword like Terminus Est. The strength of Cyclone is that it has very good mechanics and high quality of life, and it does enough damage that if you're using really any old halfway decent weapon, it will clear early maps effectively. And it has good mechanics, so you can dodge around and play well on bosses, and it also works well there. Similarly, Lacerate has very strong bleed bonuses. It has very good synergy with the Gladiator Ascendancy. Gladiator is naturally pretty fast with challenger charges. Lacerate has good coverage, and you don't need anything too specific. You don't really need to worry about hit damage, you don't need to worry about impale, you don't need to worry about crit. You can just go RT, you can just scale the bleed, you'll have a little hit damage, you get free bleed splode. Steel Mage has done this several times in SSF Hardcore, taken all the way to 100, and if you can reliably do a build in SSF HC, it's a great league starter, because, again, nothing that you have on it needs to be too specific. Sure, an Elder Mod Axe is great. Something like Rizlatha's Coil is great. Those are very nice things to have, and if you're min-maxing it, I absolutely recommend them. But the build functions fine without it. And I think that's where people make the key mistake. It is very easy to get distracted by something that looks expensive and looks hard to approach, and forget the fact that most builds at their core did not come into existence fully formed. People started them with much less gear than you see on the finished product, and over time they worked on it. There are some builds, such as Aura or Herald Stackers, that straight up don't work without a high investment into gear. But for a vast majority of builds in the game, they can be played starting from very little and scaling up. So now my question to you is, After watching this video, is there any League Start build that you previously felt was too expensive that you're now going to give another look or potentially try for Heist League? If so, what is it? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful and informative. If you have, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so that you can see all of my videos. Also consider hitting the join button so that you can support me for as low as $1 a month and help me continue to make content like this to help players like you. Thank you, have a great day, and as always, stay sane, Exiles.